Ex Nihilo. Talking to
Dear Justin McBrayer, we're very much looking forward to today's serious conversation on a topic that you've explored in your book, Beyond Fake News, from the perspective of a philosopher who firmly states the truth and nothing but the truth. But first, tell us, what prompted you to explore this subject?
Thanks for having me, first of all.
Mm-hmm.
I think, in my view, there's maybe no greater issue that humans can think about right now, other than how to figure out what's true. We're in an environment the likes of which humanity has never faced before. And I think figuring things out is a first step to solving other crises that humans are facing, whether that's climate change or wealth inequality or whatever. So I think this is really,
Sure.
really important. I'm delighted to chat with you today.
Mhm.
In terms of my own career, I had a pretty traditional scholarly career, publishing work in peer-reviewed journals, and I was actually in Austria on a Fulbright in
In Austria.
2016
Oh,
at University of Innsbruck, doing
Mhm.
work at the intersection of philosophy of religion and the sciences. It was
Ah,
an exceptional time, a great department there, and I was there during the first Trump election.
ah,
And this took the world by storm. Most people in academia did not see this coming.
Mhm.
There was this real reckoning in the aftermath of like, what caused this? How did we not see this coming? Why, how could this happen? And fake news was part of that overall explanatory picture. Right off the bat, BuzzFeed had this great little article showing that something like 17 out of the top 20 top performing articles on social media in the run up to the election came from fake websites. And, there's all this buzz around fake news. And as a epistemologist, I just wanted to start thinking about that. How is it that we figure out what's true? How have things changed from the information scape that I grew up with? How is this affecting our ability as groups to make good decisions, whether that's for our families or for democracy? And so really, I had this moment walking down the street in Innsbruck where someone approached
in
me and
Innsbruck.
said,
Okay.
"Are you an American? What's
Mhm.
happening, in your electoral system? Why are people falling for fake news?" And really from that point on, I've been thinking about misinformation and fake news and how we can do better as groups.
And if you see the Alps, you really feel a little bit humiliated.
Absolutely. Yeah. It was an inspiring place to live and work for a time.
You
Yeah.
had a very interesting predecessor in Harry Frankfurt who published a short book titled Bullshit in 2005. That is, with the advent of social media. And I too found myself using the term a few years ago in an essay for Lecture, where I made the bleak observation that we replace truth with bullshit, beauty with kitsch, and morality with moral grandstanding, highlighting the question, how did this nihilistic turn come about? What are the historical reasons for this?
Yeah. Okay. So great question. Frankfurt, I don't know if you knew this or not, Martin. Frankfurt actually published the core of
Yeah,
that material in the 80s.
the
It was a journal
1980s. Yeah,
article
yeah.
in the 80s. And then by the early 2000s, when the internet was really getting going, people thought we need to bring this back and
Yeah,
republish
yeah.
it, as a hard copy. So for those of your listeners who don't know what bullshit is, the way Harry Frankfurt analyzes it, a bullshitter is someone who has blatant disregard for the truth. So you might think as the
Mhm.
bullshitter is neither someone who's lying to you nor someone who's out to tell you the truth. They're just following other goals and they just disregard the truth entirely. If something's useful to them and it happens to be true, they'll tell you. If it's useful to them and happens to be false, they'll tell you. It's just they just have no regard for the truth.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I think you're right that there's a real sense in which what's happening now, we're seeing a sort of resurgence in bullshitting,
Mhm,
that might have been different from the way it was in the 70s, 80s, or 90s.
mhm,
Here's what I think the basic explanation is. The basic explanation for this sort of shift towards nihilism is simply a move to the lowest common denominator.
yeah, yeah.
There was this much bullshit in the
Mhm.
1980s. It's just
Sure.
that you didn't see it
Mhm,
because there
mhm,
wasn't social media.
mhm,
And in
Mhm.
large part, this is because our informational
mhm,
world in
mhm,
the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s was one that was controlled by
mhm,
gatekeepers. These were
Mhm.
newspaper editors, these were TV anchors, these were acquisitions editors at publication houses, at publishing books. There were people who were in charge of letting certain messages through and keeping certain messages out. And as a result, those gatekeepers could filter the
Mm,
bullshit before it gets into print.
mm,
They weren't perfectly good at it. They were biased in all sorts of ways, but
mm,
they did some gatekeeping. And now that gatekeeping function is
Got lost.
largely subverted. I mean, all
mm,
you have to do is have a smartphone, and there's no
mm,
editor between you and the
mm,
world
mm,
when you want to post something on social media or on X or whatever. So that's what I think the basic explanation is. It's not that there is more bullshit now. It's just that we're seeing it more because there aren't gatekeepers, keeping certain conversations and topics and whatever out of the public eye.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's the U.S. Fairness Doctrine of 1949 was repealed in 1987, and that sort of took the gate away. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of what I picked up as I was doing
Absolutely.
research for
So for
this.
those of your viewers who don't know what this is, the Fairness Doctrine was a federal rule in the United States that mandated
Mhm,
that companies who were using public airwaves,
mm,
the TV stations, radio stations, or
mm.
whatever,
Yeah, yeah,
provide
yeah.
some level of public good. It was sort of a quid pro quo. We'll let you have a monopoly
Mm,
on this frequency.
mm,
In
mhm.
exchange, you have to either, not cover certain topics, or if you do, allow both sides a say or
Mm,
whatever. So there was this sort of rule that kept people in check. The problem was, with the advent of cable news in the 1980s,
Mm,
news was not
yes.
regulated by the Fairness
yeah.
Doctrine because they weren't using public airways. And so all of the TV stations who were using public airways were thinking, we're losing out to CNN, to these,
Yeah.
so
Mhm.
there was this rise of a media empire that didn't rely on
Mm,
public airways. And so
Mhm.
really that FCC rule,
yeah.
it became odious because it was something
The
that
entertainment industry got big. Like,
It got very big.
yeah,
Yeah, and yes, as you talked about it, in 1950s America, which I remember as a child growing up, there were three major news networks:
exactly.
CBS, ABC, and NBC.
Yeah.
But as you say, today's media landscape is highly fragmented, with thousands of content creators, including people like Joe Reagan, who have these massive followings, where the key to winning the battle for attention is reaching your target audience. But doesn't this target point to the real issue? In this game of attention economy, aren't scandalons and clickbait just surrogates that generate the necessary metrics for achieving desired financial results? How would you analyze this structural problem?
Yeah, that's a nice way of putting it because it is a structural problem. And my
Mhm,
experience was not too different from yours. As a kid, we could get three channels. We had to
mhm.
get up off the couch and go turn the knob to get the little
Yep,
remote.
yep.
And then my dad got a newspaper. So that unless someone
Mhm,
called us on a landline, that was the way we got news. Through one of those
mhm,
three big networks or by reading something in the paper. So it was a really tightly controlled market. So here's how I think structurally things have changed.
mhm,
And I think you can follow this structure in three steps. Step number one, technology has lowered the barriers of entry
sure.
to the news
Sure.
market. I mean, this
Yeah.
is
mhm,
this is the fundamental first step. To produce and disseminate information in 1982 was an expensive undertaking. You had to have personnel, you had to have
mhm,
expertise. You had to have natural resources like paper and
mhm,
ink. You had to have capital,
mhm,
like a recording studio or a printing press. I mean, it was, and then even when you had all of that, your reach was fairly limited. You would be lucky to have your paper get to the next town, say, or you would be lucky
mhm,
if your channel reached, across state lines. So it was exceptionally expensive and difficult and time consuming to produce the news. Tech has changed all of that. All Joe
Sure.
Rogan needs is a video cam and a microphone and an internet connection. That is
yep.
it. And so that's step number one to this structural problem, the shift in technology. Step number two, with the lower barriers of entry to the news market, all of a sudden we have media choice, the likes of which we have
Sure.
never seen before.
Mhm,
I mean,
mhm,
when I was growing up, it was three channels and a newspaper. That was it. Now it's literally thousands of channels that I can get on multiple different devices, 24 hours a day. I mean, the options that I have to turn to for news are just mind-boggling relative to any point in time, in human history. So then this then leads to step three. Given that kind of media choice, news consumers are going to gravitate to the news channels or even the news like venues. Like, do they prefer podcasts over reading? Or, the
mhm,
the audience is going to fragment as people
Sure.
follow what it is they want. And there's this kind of natural selection at play. When news companies don't give people what they want, they go out of
Yeah.
business. So if
Mhm.
you don't do
Yeah.
clickbait,
Yeah.
you will lose out to news, companies that do clickbait. If you're only producing print media, but your market wants video a lot, you will lose out. So there's this intense competition that's leaving only the most profitable companies standing. And the profitable companies are the ones that can attract attention, regardless of what they're telling you, is true or well evidenced or researched or whatever.
Yeah.
Those are the three steps: technology, and then media choice, and then this kind of natural selection.
Yeah, we're definitely in an era where representation and the Guardian like logic is kind of over, and I would always say like we live in the epoch of the free radicals in many ways. Like, from my German perspective, the changes we're facing suggest that what you call entertainment is deeply rooted in our discontent with modernity. Historically, this goes back a long, long way. Julian Bender was already discussing the betrayal of the intellectuals in the 1920s, as was Eric Hoffer in the US, and George Orwell was already dealing with intellectuals' cognitive dissonance in the 1940s. I suspect that this cultural unease is deeply connected to the idea that modernity recognizes acts without a perpetrator, something Kierkegaard made clear in his remarkable Diary of a Seducer. This
Mm.
entire situation can be summed up by a quote from Hitler: "If the Jews did not exist, one would have to invent them." Isn't this the real background behind the rise of fake news? That people, that the free radicals, so to speak, are retribalizing and creating scapegoats to blame for the struggles in vain?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right at its basis. It's human nature that's ultimately
Mhm.
driving the problem. It's not actually the technology, it's not actually the
Sure.
market. It's
Mhm.
actually the consumer that's driving everything.
Yeah,
And it
yeah, yeah.
turns out that humans are deeply tribal. So on the one hand, it's not like we've become more tribal in our proclivities. Humans, evolved to be, these tribal creatures where we think in terms of in-group and out-group,
Mm,
and that affects the way that we evaluate arguments and the way that
mm,
we collect evidence and the way
Mhm.
that we, posture ourselves. So the tribalism has always been there. But the kind of technology that we have allows us to leverage our tribalism in ways that we couldn't even
sure.
20 or 30 years ago. So let me just give you a couple examples. I mean, one, technology allows us to physically build tribes in ways that we couldn't in
Mm,
the 1980s. I mean, the fact that you can get a job where you work remotely allows you
sure.
to choose where you want to
Mhm.
live.
Mm,
And we're seeing a real segregation, at least in the United
mm,
States, where people are choosing states, cities, and
mm,
neighborhoods on the basis of
mm,
whether people look like them, vote like
mm,
them, think like them, and
mm,
so forth. There's a great book by
Yep.
Bill Bishop called The Big Sort that tracks some of
mm,
the sociological data. And it's just astounding how, as technology gives us ways to be connected over social media or to work remotely or
mm,
whatever, people are literally uprooting themselves and replanting themselves in,
mm,
in with their tribe. So I think that's part of the story. We're literally becoming
mm,
physically isolated into our
mm,
tribes. But two, this technology has allowed the sort of tribal part of our mind to build our virtual
mm,
spaces in a way that reinforce our tribes. In the 1980s, if you had some weird conspiracy theory, you were probably the only person in your town that had that weird
mm,
conspiracy theory. But now
mm,
on the internet, you
Mhm.
can go look the world over and you can find the 15 other people who share that conspiracy theory, and you can build your own tribe. So we can find tribal members in ways that we haven't before. We can signal our tribal
mm.
membership in ways that we hadn't before. In the 1980s, when my dad read a story in the newspaper that he didn't agree with, no one else in the world knew that he didn't agree with it, except for me. I was sitting at the breakfast table, so I didn't.
Of course.
But now you read something and you can post your
Mhm.
reaction to Twitter, so everybody knows how you stand on this particular issue.
Mhm.
You're consuming news in a conspicuous way
Mm,
that
mm,
that flags for everybody else what tribe you belong to.
mm.
Mhm.
You can police the boundaries of your tribe in ways that you haven't before. You can
Blocking, yeah.
identify
Yes.
scapegoats and
Mm,
hold them up to be
mm, mm,
targeted in ways
Mhm.
that you couldn't before. Because now
mm,
all you have to do is find some tweet that you
mm,
don't like, that you think is the root of
mm,
the problem. You can retweet it to your followers and say,
mm,
here's the problem. It's this,
mm,
you know, it's Israel or
This
Hamas
very
or
guy.
whatever. You just do
Yeah,
everything.
exactly.
So the technology kind of allowed us to exercise our tribalism in ways that we've never been able to do it before.
Martin and I have been discussing the attention economy for some time now. And what makes it unique, we think, is that we're dealing with a societal shift that's taken place largely behind the scenes.
Yeah.
In the 1970s, we had Herbert Simon, who recognized that there were no longer any scarcities in the digital world. And then in the 1980s, this German systems architect, Jörg Frank, extended this by coining the term the attention economy. But doesn't this simply mean one thing, that if clickbait, angertainment, that's a hard word for me to say,
Yeah.
angertainment, and the scandalons are the economic incentives, then aren't we facing a systemic crisis of capitalism? Looking back, many of the phenomena, such as the financial crisis of 2008 and 9, can only be understood from a psychological perspective of massified attention. How else can we explain risk-averse lemmings rushing collectively towards an abyss? And why are there hardly any other notable theoretical analysis of this problem?
Yeah. You can't explain it well in any other way. So I think you're exactly right that it is a market explanation. So kind of brief background. When people are thinking about the rise in misinformation or why our informational landscape is more polluted now than it was, say, 30 years ago, there are competing explanations. I'll just flag two for you. Some people think of it purely in terms of sabotage. So there are actors out there who are producing, blatantly false stories. So what they would call disinformation, whether this is some Russian disinformation troll
Yeah.
The
farm
puppet master.
in Europe, right? Or some political action committee. Like they offer this kind of sabotage explanation for what's going on. There's also a competing explanation that thinks of misinformation and disinformation in public health viral type terms.
Yeah.
So you think of misinformation as like a virus of the mind, and whether it's put out in the internet accidentally or on purpose, misinformation is like a virus. It takes root in our minds and we spread it to someone else. So I think there are competing analyses of this problem. To my mind, those analyses fail to understand what's really going on or provide us a deep enough explanation. And I think the point you made about markets is exactly right. One takeaway from this podcast for all of your listeners should be this: information exists in a marketplace. People buy and sell and trade information, misinformation, disinformation. And once we start thinking about it like a marketplace, we're in a better position to understand why people consume what they do, why certain companies are profitable and why some are not. And then in terms of markets, as you pointed out, markets can fail. Think of the financial crisis
Sure.
of 2007, 8, and 9. What happened there was you had people who were operating within the market, all looking out for their best interest. But collectively, when each person was looking out for their best interest, whether you were a CEO of a bank or whether you were, someone looking to get a home mortgage, everyone's looking out for their own interest resulted in a kind of market failure. I think something similar is happening here. From the consumer perspective, there's no reason not to consume shady information or
Yeah.
information if it doesn't make your life worse. If there's no material cost of error to getting things wrong, you might as well believe what makes you happy. You might as well believe what makes you fit in with your coworkers. You might as well believe what your neighbors believe because you want to be the outlier. So consumers are just doing what they want. They're consuming the news that makes them happy. And producers are doing what they want. They're producing the news that makes a profit. Well, we're now set up for another kind of market failure. Markets are not aimed at external goods like truth or beauty or whatever. Markets are designed to efficiently get people what they want. And the unfortunate fact is, people don't want the whole truth and nothing but the truth. So that's what our information market is getting now.
I would say, like, structurally, having written of digitalization, so I see like a lot of things as a structural change. And when we look at the old representational logic, we could say it's a one-to-many logic. It's like a pyramid. Is it like this representation? The guardians at the top, the big audience at the bottom, etc. But what we have now is like the network effect, which is overcoming this whole scarcity logic. And we got like a one-to-many logic. Like everybody's like producing now, and like if you've got like 10 10,000 like-minded people, your impact might be really, really huge. So that even like fringe groups,
Scalability.
because of the
Hmm.
scalability factor, might have like an impact on the societal discourse, which is way bigger than like the real influence they have, which is a weird
Yeah.
skewing of the whole landscape, is it?
Yeah. So, yeah, this is a tricky question. If you're thinking about the sort of pyramid effect,
Hmm.
Yeah,
the thought it's something like, well, what we'll do is we'll have guardians or gatekeepers or censors, depending
Yeah,
on who we want to
sure.
this out, and
Mhm.
they're going to make sure that only the true gets through, or only the reasonable gets through, or only the well evidence gets through, or whatever. Human history is rife with examples of exactly those kind of information scapes. And inevitably, what we see is the people in power let through the information that's good for them and keep the information back that's bad for them. So, for example,
sure.
Mhm.
Russia has very strict rules right now about what journalists can say in at least particular
Mhm.
domains, including, the military action in
Yeah,
Ukraine.
yeah,
Singapore
Mhm.
has very strict rules about, what counts as fake news. China obviously does. North Korea obviously does. When you look at those kind of informational regimes, you'll see that they're not very good at getting to the truth
yeah,
because they've
yeah,
got
yeah.
ulterior political motives. So, from my point of view, it's not going to be an improvement to somehow put someone in charge at the top to try to make judgment call about what's true or what's reasonable or whatever. I mean, just think, for example, in the United States right now. Um,
Mhm.
I think many people, even if you voted for President Trump, would not want the Trump administration to be able to make the call on what
Yeah,
you
yeah,
can say on social media and what you
yeah, yeah,
can't, right?
yeah,
This is
yeah, yeah,
this
yeah.
is a recipe
Mhm.
for you know, for
Yeah, yeah,
disaster.
yeah, yeah.
So now you're stuck then, Martin, with this problem. Okay, we don't have guardians, we have this kind of mania. What do we do? Well, I mean, here's at least two things we could do. Thing number one, we can do what we can as societies to build and preserve epistemically virtuous institutions, groups of
Sure.
people,
Okay.
network,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
institutions that are good
yeah,
at getting to the truth,
yeah,
even
yeah,
when it's
yeah.
inconvenient. So, for example,
Mhm.
right now in the United States, there are some deep doubts about whether our public health
Mm-hmm.
administration at the federal level is doing a good job of getting us to the truth. I mean, I've had people email me and say, "Hey, you work in fake news. Should I trust what you know public health officials are saying now about vaccines?" And what
Mm-hmm.
Oh
happened
my
is they've been
God.
they've been packed with political appointees to the point that
Mhm.
now people are hesitant to trust those institutions. So that's the kind of thing that we can't do. We need to build robust universities, robust research centers, robust institutions who can focus on
Sure.
the truth. And that's maybe the best thing we can do since there are
Yeah.
no guardians. And number two, this is controversial, but I think we should pull back on some of our efforts on what you might think of as public literacy. Like some people tend to
Mm,
think that if we just teach people how to use the internet or how to check a source or how to read horizontally, that somehow that's going to fix the problem. But on one view, the problem isn't that
Mhm.
consumers can't find the truth. The problem is that they don't actually care. And so
yeah.
we're better redirecting those resources to
Mm.
build institutions that will hone in on the truth and be concerned less about whether the average Joe is finding it.
I can completely understand your philosophical insistence on the truth and nothing but the truth. Only by approaching the principle of reality with humility can we avoid misusing any information as domination technique and declare ourselves the owners of truth. In other words, you must accept that we can never fully possess the truth. Plato attempted to convey this through this cave allegory and the construction of archetypes as pure ideas which live in the past. Still, I personally doubt whether the model of the philosopher king, or in fact the guardian of truth, remains relevant and working today. This might have worked in the age of representation, as in the world of CBS, ABC, and NBC, but the German example of the Volksempfänger radio tells a different story. However, today, when anyone can have a voice on social media as a content creator, this is no longer realistic. So how can we preserve the truth? We don't want to hand it over to politically dubious fact checkers.
Yeah, nice. And this, I think, echoes some of the answer that I gave you just a moment ago.
Mhm.
On the one hand, the fact checking strategy suffers from all the kind of censorship problems that I just pointed out
Yeah.
earlier.
Sure. And it becomes an economy.
Exactly. That's exactly right. I mean, think of how fact checking would work in any other area of the market, right? I mean, it's not like when you
Exactly.
put a label on, like actually
Yeah.
a perfect example. In the United States, a number of years ago, there was an initiative to have fast food restaurants add calories to their menus.
Mm.
Yeah, yeah,
The
yeah.
idea is when you went into McDonald's, instead of just ordering a big,
Mhm.
you'd see Big Mac, you have X number of calories, and then you think,
Mm.
whoa, not
Yeah.
with that much, so maybe I'll order, a salad instead, right? This is the idea. Give more
Yep.
information, and well, I mean,
Mhm.
Mm.
you can guess what happened. So in fact, this passed. It was a kind of public health
Mm.
measure. Fast food restaurants complied. Well, in the first, 6 months or so, we saw people's orders change slightly. And then after 6 months, it was right back to where it was before, and there's been no change. So giving
Mm.
people the sort of extra, this is fact checking, right? This was
Mhm.
fact checking the fast food menu. Like, let me
Mhm.
put a little warning tag on here. Do you know that this has made almost no difference to what people order? So I'm equally dubious of fact checking in the news. You can have a little warning, you can have a little tag. People are going to consume that kind of crazy partisan media that makes them happy, regardless of whether you label it that way or not. So I think that kind of strategy is not going to be useful. Instead, I do think a more reasonable strategy for saving knowledge, which is, I think, what we're really after. Maybe the truth is still out there, but as a society, we're losing knowledge, is that we want institutions that are knowledge creators
Yeah,
and
yeah.
knowledge keepers. And that may be the best that we can do, even if people outside of those institutions are going to follow those marketplace pressures where they will. If we have institutions that we can use as like epistemic backstops
Yeah, yeah.
for
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
elections, epistemic backstops for national decisions or whatever, that's probably the best we can do.
I would say this one really interesting argument. Hopkins and I talk very much about it. Like we pay attention in these days, etc., but we don't save attention and store attention. But the thing is, like for example, if you take even the
Mhm.
word interest, which goes back to the Middle Ages and means like also like usury, etc.,
Mhm.
it's like you store interest in a way that it's kind of like persistent. Like what we have today is like we pay attention, but it's a time shrinking to a second. And we always make this little fun of like Kim Kardashian's butt being kind of like a piggy bank, etc. And maybe that's not really working.
It's
So
working
maybe,
24 hours a day. Yeah.
but like it should be like that we should. I mean, what you're talking about, the institutions, is like in fact like an architecture which should preserve attention on the long run. Like saying, okay, this is going to stay like for 10 years, 15 years, etc. It's not something for the moment that we pay attention for a little candle.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah, they're like, you can almost think about it like maybe these institutions have two functions: the discovery function and the preservation function.
yeah, yeah,
So we were
exactly.
just
Yeah,
talking
yeah,
about a bank,
yeah,
the bank of
yeah, yeah,
getting up that's the
yeah, yeah.
preservation function. But we want institutions who will pursue the argument where it leads,
Yeah.
that will accumulate high quality evidence,
Yeah, yeah,
that will allow internal dissent, that will have people from various diversity across political parties, so it doesn't look
yeah,
like
yeah,
it's stashed with all people who have preconceived ideas about. I mean, this is what we want. We want universities and think tanks and research centers that are pursuing or that are
yeah, yeah,
incentivized
yeah, yeah,
to discover and preserve the truth at all costs. Because when we lose that, we cannot rely on the market to do it for us. I think that's what we're
yeah, yeah,
learning. The
yeah,
market
yeah,
does not do a good job of that,
yeah.
simply because the incentives of the consumers in the market and the incentive
Mm,
of the producers in the news market
mm,
are not well aligned with the truth.
yeah,
And if they're
yeah,
not,
yeah.
who is going to do that work?
It's a limbo economy, really going
Yeah.
down. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. We suspect that the resentment we're experiencing today isn't caused by social media, which you talk about, but it's rooted in this value crisis brought on by digitalization, which, fueled by AI, will only get worse. Shouldn't we be asking ourselves, how has this digitalization transformed the epistemic field? And what will we deem to be true, good, and aesthetically beautiful in the future?
Okay, future predictions are tough. There's book after book.
Yeah.
Experts are really bad at prognosticating about the future, so I want to be cautious about that. But I mean, I think if you look to the past, it's going to be our best guide as to how the future will unfold. And so I just ask you to think for a moment about the information revolution that happened with the printing press. right?
We talk
I
about
mean,
that a lot,
this is
yes.
about, this is, I mean, to maybe the
Mhm,
modern ear, it's very hard to understand how radical this was.
Sure.
But I mean,
mhm,
for hundreds of years, people all across, medieval Europe knew where to get their information. They knew who to
Mm,
trust. They were powerful gatekeepers.
mm,
They were only letting certain messages through. I mean, if you were at a small village in rural Germany at the time, you got your information
mhm,
from the local priest and from what you could discern in the stained glass
sure.
windows at your local, church. That was it. And all of a sudden, this technology would allow anybody to print. I mean,
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
like the smartphone, right? All of a sudden,
yeah,
anybody
yeah,
can
yeah,
yeah,
print
yeah.
up a message and distribute it. And all of a sudden, we're inundated by crazy ideas. And I mean, this turned our informational world upside down. And you can have some sympathy for, what people who lived through that era must have felt like, where they were like, well, who do we trust? My priest says this, but now there's this tract circulating in town, that says
mhm,
something radically different. And but anyway, it just the technology of the printing press just radically altered our informational landscape. And it took 100+ years for us to figure out how to manage that. We had
Yeah,
to
yeah.
think through things
yeah,
like peer review. We had to build institutions like the Royal Society. We had to, develop, university libraries. And, we had to develop institutions that would help us find our way through. In my view, we're experiencing something,
Very
similar
similar.
shift
Yeah,
the
just like that
interregnum,
now.
yeah,
yes,
All of a
yeah, yeah,
sudden, we have radical technology. We don't know
yeah,
who
yeah,
to
mhm,
yeah,
trust
yeah,
anymore.
yeah,
Anybody
yeah.
can publish whatever they
yeah.
want. We're not sure what's true. We're going to have to develop epistemic institutions that will shepherd us through this radical change in our informational environment.
Lucien Febvre et Saint-Martin, who wrote a book about l'apparition du livre, the appearance of the printed book, etc. So they made a very funny and very, I would say, a very apt description, etc. They said, okay, that the 15th centuries was more familiar with the Middle Ages than the Middle Ages with itself. Because, like, what would they do? They would print all the books from the 12th, 13th century. Meaning, so we like kind of like
Reading back.
we're equipped with digital media. We go back into the 19th century. So I always make fun of like this little Victor Hugo quotation, etc., who said like, is there something which is like bigger than the idea whose time has come? And I said, sure, there's something bigger. The idea whose time has passed away. Because like you don't have to pay an entry price for that. So meaning the past is easier to get for the consumer to get into past fantasies about authorship, authenticity, and like identity, etc., than really like encountering our very complicated digital world where like all these roles are getting kind of shattered and you live on sand in a
Yeah.
way.
And notice, Martin, that AI will just amplify that very
Yeah, yeah,
trend.
Yeah,
yeah,
Because AI is pulling primarily from the past, right?
yeah, yeah,
It's
sure,
sure.
drawing on the database of human knowledge,
yeah, yeah,
which is
yeah, yeah,
mostly about what's happened up to this date. Getting AI
Mhm,
information about what's happening today is much more difficult than getting an AI
yeah, yeah,
summary of
yeah.
events in 1985. So AI, I think, is also, as my students and other people are relying on it, it's also making it clear that it's easier for us to draw on that well of information from the past rather
Yeah, yeah.
than think about what's happening now or in the future.
I know you said it already. You're a little bit reluctant in regards of prophecies and the
our
like. So,
question,
but
yeah.
if you were a science fiction author, and you also go back into the past of Plato and the like, if you were a science fiction author, imagine Plato reincarnated at the end of the century, a century in which dystopian tendencies are likely to intensify. What would this philosopher king say about this century? What would the utopian state he imagines look like?
Great question. I mean, the sardonic side of me says that Plato in the year 2100 would look back and say, see, I told you democracy wouldn't work out. Right. He was deeply skeptical of democracy, and democracy's had a great track record so far, but democracy has not had to deal with, the digital
Yeah,
information
yeah.
revolution yet. So maybe he would look back and say that. I do think one of the major lessons of the 21st century, or one of the events that maybe precipitates one of these major lessons, is the fall of the gatekeepers.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm,
We are going to learn what humans are like, informationally, what they want to consume, what they care about, what they don't care about, how they think in ways that we were insulated from in prior years. When it was expensive to publish a book, you had to convince a editor to go. I mean, the gatekeepers have given us a very myopic view of humanity. They've been showing us the best authors. They have been showing us the best ideas for the news. They have been showing us the most well-evidenced theories of current events and whatever, because those were the things that were making it through these professional gatekeepers. And now we're seeing what humanity is like at its core.
Yeah.
Without the
Very
gatekeepers.
mediocre.
Exactly. And I think we are going to be in for something of a shocker, because we're going to find that people don't think the ways that we might have thought they would, given what we learned in university in the 1980s and 90s. We're getting a raw, unvarnished, unfiltered view of what humans are like with their tribalism and their scapegoating and everything else. And I think that is the story of the 21st century.
And so maybe you're in the age to have kids. Have you?
I do, yes, too.
Okay, so what are the stories that you're telling your kids about the future? I mean, because they might live even at the end of the century. So
they actually, I learn more from them than I think they learn from me on this front, because I'm asking them about what they're seeing on TikTok and why they think the way they do about particular current event. I mean, just even watching the difference in people's lenses on the Israel-Hamas conflict.
Yeah.
It's radically different whether you're getting your news through TikTok, whether you're getting your news from CNN, whether you're getting your news from a right-wing channel. So that my kids end up being more like my guinea pigs, because I get to see the world, through their informational eyes, which, like I said, are very different from mine, given my reading habits and how I grew up.
So you're not only a father, but also like an anthropologist, like looking at the lower echelons of society and human nature.
Exactly. And actually, speaking of anthropologists, some of this stuff reminds me of the work of Rene Girard, the huge anthropologist who has really interesting stuff to say about evolution of religion and
mimetic desire.
In particular, his scapegoating stuff. I see this in social media where, in the United States recently, it's been Charlie Kirk, but it could be any number of people, where people identify scapegoats and they use it as like this kind of social media catharsis to unite their group, to target other groups. I think his work is really insightful about how human tribalism gets exercised in a social setting. And there's a book waiting to be written there, I think, about Rene Girard in modern social media.
Dear Justin, thank you very much for this very enlightening conversation. So it's really a pleasure to have this conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having me. As I said at the outset, I think this is one of the most crucial issues we can be thinking about right now. How do we know what's true? How do we know who to trust? And so I appreciate your having me on and getting a chance to chat about it with you this morning.